Alright, so I'm going to be giving you an overview of Substance Painter. The version I'm going to be using for this demonstration is 2017, but there is a newer version available. The major difference is that the UI has been completely reskinned, but everything else is basically labeled the same and put in the same place. So everything I'm showing you here is going to be applicable to that version. So the first thing you want to do when you load up Substance Painter in order to start a new project, obviously, would be to go to File, New. Once you do that, it's going to bring up this new project dialog, where it's going to allow you to select a rendering template, basically a template for what it's going to be mimicking in your render over here. So you have Unity 5, Unreal Engine 4, Dota 2, all of these different templates in here. By default, it's set to Unreal Engine 4, which is what I'm going to be using for this demonstration. Over here, you have the mesh that you're going to be using to paint on in Substance Painter. And you have a checkbox for create a texture set per UDIM tile. You have a normal map format, which is either OpenGL or DirectX. We're going to be using DirectX for the purposes of this demonstration. Whether or not to compute tangent space per fragment, and your document resolution. So document resolution can be anywhere from 128 to 4K. You can also bump this up to 8K by modifying a setting in Substance Painter, but we're not going to be doing that for this demonstration. And down here, you can add other textures to import. So if you've already generated a normal map or an albedo or whatever it is you want to apply it to your model, to your mesh, and then start working from there, you can do that as well. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to select a mesh to bring in here. This is a mesh that I've already created. It's a fire hydrant that was actually done from a photogrammetry capture and solve, and then I retopologized it. So once that's selected, I'm just going to hit OK. As you can see, it's imported the mesh. It's in the 3D viewport here. And if you hit F1, 2, or 3 on the keyboard, it's going to cycle through the different view modes. So F1 shows your 3D viewport next to your UV viewport on the side. F2 is just your 3D viewport, and then F3 is going to show just your UV. All right, so if I have these two side by side, and I want to change the rotation of the image-based lighting, all I have to do is hold Shift and right mouse, and then rotate left or right. And as you can see, it updates in the UV viewport as well. So the UV viewport is actually a representation of the 3D viewport, just laid out on top of the UVs. Now, one thing to keep in mind, and the best way to kind of interpret Substance Painter when you first get started is that it is, for the most part, it's Photoshop, but in 3D. And rather than just allowing you to do one texture at a time, it allows you to go in and create full materials with brush strokes and filters and all that good stuff. So most of the, if you're familiar with Photoshop, most of the stuff you use in here is going to be very, very familiar. All right, now one thing that I normally do when I first create a project in Substance Painter is I go in and I change my environment map. So the environment map is basically a SIBL, a smart image-based lighting. And if I go in here and I scrub this opacity up and then bring down the blur, you can see that this is the environment map that's being used, right? And as I hold Shift and right drag, it's going to rotate. So it's actually getting all the lighting from that image. Right. So what I normally do, just to get the most neutral lighting, so I make sure that the mesh is going to, or that the materials are going to look like what I want them to in Engine or whatever software I'm going to bring them into. I go over here and I change my environment map to Studio 2. For me, this seems to be the most neutral lighting, and I usually work with the opacity all the way down. Another thing that I usually do is when I create a project, I set the working resolution to 2K. Because it gives the best trade-off between performance and quality. As you start adding more layers and all that, it becomes more performance heavy, and at 2K you get to see pretty close to what it's going to look like in 4K. Another thing to keep in mind is that the workflow in Substance Painter is non-destructive, which means you can work in any of these resolutions and then change the resolution later without losing any quality. So I'm going to go through each of these panes real quick and all of the menu items, and then we'll actually start creating some materials on top of this mesh. All right, so starting from the top, you have your normal file menu up here. So you have File, which has all of your standard settings to be used to in any other program. A few differences would be import resources, export mesh, and export textures, which we're going to get to later after we actually create some materials. Import resources will allow you to import textures like you had in the new document dialog. Export mesh will do just that. It'll export whatever mesh you have in here. You have edit, it has your standard settings there. You have mode, whether or not you're in painting or rendering. We'll get into rendering in a little bit. Rendering is using iRay, so it's a little bit of allows you to see a pre-rendered version of your scene. Then you have view, and you can go in and change all of the view settings under here. You have plugins, so it has all of the defaults built in, and then you can add plugins here. And then help has all of your general help stuff. Now over here, when you get down to the toolbar, the main toolbar down here, you have you can go to the Substance Share website. You have your paint tool, which if you hold click on it will give you two different options. And any of these that have a down arrow will give you multiple options when you hold on it. Okay. So this one is the eraser. This one is projection. This one is polyfill. So this is basically telling you how you're going to be filling your mask, which I'll get to in a minute. This is a smudge tool, clone tool. This is your material picker. You can actually, it's just like a color sampler, but for materials. This is symmetry, and this gives you multiple options. If you enable this, it tells you which way you want to mirror, or it allows you to select which way you want to mirror, and whether or not to show the symmetry plane. This here is your view mode, which I showed you F1, 2, and 3. This is how your camera acts, whether it's free rotation or constrained rotation. And this is perspective or ortho view, which you can control by hitting F5 or F6. That's ortho, that's perspective. And then this is your rendering view using iRay. This over here is lazy mouse, which will literally just make the mouse movement. So if you click and drag with the mouse rather than just moving with right where your mouse is, it's going to have a little trail behind it, which allows you to get smoother curves and straighter lines and all that. And since we already touched on iRay, I'm going to show you that real quick. So if I click on this and it launches the iRay renderer, you'll see at the bottom it says warming up. So as you can see in here, it has all the same controls for movement and all that you have in the normal 3D viewport. So holding Alt and left mouse is going to allow you to rotate around. Alt and middle mouse is going to allow you to drag. Left and Alt and right mouse is going to allow you to zoom in and out. Shift and left mouse is going to allow you to, Shift and right mouse is going to allow you to rotate the symbol around. As you can see up here, it has a status for rendering. So right now it is rendering, and then once it's done, this will show it's complete. Depending on the complexity of your object and all that good stuff, it's usually pretty quick. See, now it says status done. That means this is completely rendered. It's not doing any more rendering work. And you can modify all of your samples and everything like that you'd be used to in any kind of like V-Ray, iRay type rendering setup. And as you go down here, you have all of your, as I said, more standard settings for pre-rendering. You have your environment map. You can change that out separately here than what you have in your working viewport. You can adjust the environment exposure, environment rotation, all that. You can go in and modify the dome itself. So the way this is rendered is it has a flat surface underneath, and then it's got basically a hemisphere over the top, and that's where your image-based lighting is coming from. And then in here, you can go in and change the scale, the radius, where the ground plane sits. Normally, it's going to snap right below your mesh. It should do that by default. So it looks like it's sitting right on the ground. You can modify your reflectivity, glossiness, shadow intensity, whether or not it's visible from below, which means if you go down here, you can see that the plane is actually visible when you go below it. If I uncheck that, you can see it see-through. This allows you to select what type of shaders being used, which I'll get to in a minute. You have different types of shaders for different types of rendering. And these are all of your parameters for emissive, anisotropy, and refraction, which I'll also touch on a little later. Another thing you can do in your viewer settings for the dome is you can click on clear color. Now what this will do is render just a solid color in the background. You'll still receive shadows and all that stuff on the ground plane, but you can go in and change this rather than showing the environment map. Usually I like to use, when I'm doing renders, I usually use like a medium gray, something like this. Okay. Then down in display settings, you have controls for your camera. So you have field of view, focus distance, aperture, and then you have post-processing. So you have your anti-aliasing, color correction, depth of field, tone mapping, glare, vignette, lens distortion, all of that. And then you can also activate color profile if you like and import your own color profile. All right. So in order to get out of the iRenderer, you just click on the icon again for the little camera, and then you're back in your working environment. And also one thing to note in the 3D viewport, everything is contextual. I'll give you a contextual tooltip. So if I hold Shift, and this is going to pop up. It's going to say it's going to show me everything that I can do using the Shift modifier, right? So Shift and left is drawing straight lines. Control Shift left, draw snapped straight lines, etc. Same thing goes for S, which is for the stencil, which I'll get into a little bit. And as I said, everything is contextual for whatever modifier you're holding. So going on to the rest of the panes and palettes in the Substance Painter UI. Now, normally I would lay this out so my 3D viewport is on my left monitor, and then I have my entire tool palette set up on my right monitor. But so I can get everything in one screen on this video, I'm just keeping it all as a default layout. So you can organize things by dragging and dropping them around. So this here is your layers palette. So as you can see, by default, it has just a normal layer. And then up here, you have your different options for layers. So as I hover over each of these, you can see what it is. So this one will allow me to add an effect. This one is configure a mask. This one is to edit layer, add fill layer, add a smart material, add a folder, and then delete the selected layer. And this works very much like Photoshop. You can show and hide with this little circle here. You can change the blending mode here. You can change the opacity of the layer here. Over here, you have your texture set list. So this texture set list is basically the material IDs that you set up in Maya or whatever 3D package you're using. So if I have multiple materials attached to this, or it's multiple meshes with multiple materials, they're all shown here. And this little circle here will allow me to hide or show the surfaces of that material applied to it. And then you can solo or select all if you have multiple set up in the mesh. And each of these material IDs, or these texture set lists, are going to have a separate set of layers, right? So this hydrant material would have a set of layers, and if I had another one for like the bolts, that would have a separate layer set. So they're completely assigned to your texture set list here. All right, going down here on the right, you have the properties for paint. Now, this is actually your properties palette in general, so if I switch to a different tool, this is all contextual based on that tool. So since right now I have the paintbrush selected, these are all the settings for the paintbrush here. And these are all straightforward. I'm not going to go in detail through all of them, but it's your brush size, flow, stroke opacity, spacing, feathering, all of that good stuff. Some things to note in here is that you have alignment. So alignment allows you to switch between camera, tangent wrap, tangent planar, or UV. And all these affect how you paint on the surface. So if I have it set to the default and I go to paint in the UV, for example, you'll see that the scale of the brush is actually changing based on the 3D geometry. You can see it moving around. It's based on the 3D surface, even though I'm in the UV. So it's acting the same as it would if I were on this surface. If I change this to UV instead, you'll see that it's doing the exact same thing. That's because the alignment is set to UV, but the size space is actually set to object still. So if I go to size space, I can change that to either viewport, texture, or object. So if I set it to texture, you'll see now that the size of the brush does not change. It stays consistent based on the 2D size of the UV, not the 3D size in space. If I change it to viewport, it's going to do the same thing, but it's going to be based on the viewport size rather than the size of the texture. I'm going to set these back to default. And this here allows you to enable or disable backface culling. So basically, if you're painting on this side of the mesh, it won't bleed through to the other side past a certain angle. Right now, it's at 90 degrees. Here you can select the alpha for your brush. If you just click on this, it has a bunch of default alphas, and you can bring your own in, which I will get to in a minute. You can modify the seed of your brush. You can adjust the hardness here, which is the feathering. You can also do that in the viewport by holding Control and then right-clicking and dragging in and out. That's going to control the feathering of your brush. And if I hold Control, you can see the context menu pop up for everything else that you can do with that. This is where you can select a stencil. So a stencil, which we'll also get to a little later, allows you to actually select an overlay in your scene. And then you can paint using that overlay as a mask, right? So if I go in and paint this right now, it's going to pick up the information based on how this is laid out. So if you do it over the UV, it's going to be in 2D space here. If you do it over the 3D mesh, it's going to kind of wrap around based on the shape that you have here. And then I can go in and scale that. I can move it around. Once again, I can rotate it. And then if you hold Shift while rotating, this goes for anything. If you're rotating objects, whatever it is, it's going to snap. All right. And then if I hold S again, you have this context menu that shows you what everything does for the stencil itself. All right, so I'm going to get rid of that stencil for now. And then down here, you have all of your material settings. So these boxes up here allow you to tell Substance Painter what your layer is affecting. So right now this layer is affecting color, height, roughness, metallic, and normal. And you can actually add more into here, which I will get to in a minute. And then your material mode is the actual material you're using. So you can select that from here. Or you can just select a base color, which is a texture. So if you've already created an albedo, for example, you can just bring that in and then start working on top of that. Or you can just use a uniform color. Now, since this layer is just a regular layer, not a fill layer, this is not affecting anything. This layer allows you to actually go in and paint colors and all that good stuff, whereas a fill layer is going to fill everything based on a mask, and you can apply a material to that and do a bunch of different things, which, as I said, we'll get into as well. I can go in and add a height texture, or just use a uniform value, 0 to black, or I'm sorry, black to white. Roughness value, 0 to 1. And metallic value to 0, 1. And all of these, if I click on this box here, is going to allow me to actually import a map for that, a texture map. So I can go in and bring in my own maps and mix and match them however I want to. Now getting back to the material modes up here, what you're telling the thing to, the layer to actually affect. You can click them to disable them. So right now color is disabled, everything else is enabled, or you can enable them by clicking it again. Now if you want to go in and add new parts of the material, say I want to go in and add emissive, you go over to your texture set settings here, and I'll get into more of this in a second, but in order to add another one of these, like another parameter for material, you click on this plus next to channels, and then it allows you to add any of these in here, right? So let's say I want to go in and add an emissive, right? I can do that now, and as you see, emissive now shows up here. By default, it's going to be disabled. If I want to enable it, I just click on it. And then I can go in and have a separate layer just for emissive, which is normally how I use the emissive channel. All right, I'm going to get rid of that now. So going back into texture set settings, in here you have undo stack, where you can actually see the undos for everything that you've done for your texture sets. And then texture set here is everything to do with your texture set. So your document size, which we've already gone over, what channels you're using. So I have base, color, height, roughness, metallic, and normal, which are the defaults. How the normal mixing works, whether or not it's combining or replacing. Ambient occlusion mixing, right now it's set to multiply by default, but I don't have an AO imported. Additional maps, which allows me to bake textures, which I will get to in a minute. And all of these are the maps that you can have project-wide. Per texture set, right? So these are all the maps for the texture set. So a normal map, world space normal map, select ID map, ID map, ambient occlusion map, all that. So these can either be imported and just plugged in by clicking on these and selecting one, right? And I currently don't have anything in here. Or I can go in here and do bake textures, which I'll also get back to in a minute. Before I do that, I'm going to jump into display settings. So display settings are going to allow me to change what I have in the viewport here. So my field of view, focus distance, aperture, and whether or not to activate post effects in here. And then I can also activate color profile. So these are redundancy from what you saw in the iRay renderer. And now if I go into viewer settings, this allows me to select my mode for editing. So I can go into solo, additional map, or material. So if I go into solo, this is only going to isolate the layer that I have selected. Additional map is going to be, I believe it's the map from the texture set settings here. So it's going to show just these maps together because these are all the additional maps. I can modify the stencil opacity. If I go back to material, and then I can select my environment map, which I already went over. This is the smart image-based lighting map that's being used on the dome. I can adjust the environment opacity. I can adjust the environment exposure, which is going to affect lighting. I can adjust the environment rotation, same as holding shift and right dragging. I can control the environment blur. I can enable or disable shadows in the real-time viewport. And as you can see, they also use a kind of like a pre-rendered, I think they still use iRay, so they kind of slowly generate and get better and better. So as you move the camera around, since they are screen space, they're going to change. And I can adjust the heaviness of the rendering for the shadows, so intensive, average, or lightweight. I can modify the shadow opacity here. I can also select my shader here. So the shader is going to allow me to achieve different methods of rendering. So by default, everything is opaque, but let's say I wanted to go in and do a transparent material. I would want to go and select this. So PBR metal rough with alpha blending. And then you have different material selects here that you can go in. So you can do clay similar to ZBrush. You can go in and modify all these based on what you're doing. By default, you're normally either going to use just PBR metallic rough or PBR metallic rough with alpha blending. And then down here, you have your instance names. You can go in and change that. You have shader parameters, which you can go in and modify here. So AO intensity, height, force, all that good stuff. Parallax occlusion mapping, which you can enable or disable here, which will actually give you virtualized displacement on the surface. You can modify the stencil opacity here. So the stencil I showed you before, you can modify how intense its alpha is when you're actually using it. You can check whether or not to hide the stencil when you're painting. So so it shows up, and then when you start painting, it disappears. So you can see what the actual mask looks like when you paint it down. You can enable or disable wireframe here, and modify the wireframe color, and modify the wireframe opacity, all under the viewer settings here. So now going back to texture set settings, I'm going to show you how to bake textures. So bake textures works pretty much the same way that it does in XNormal. I usually prefer to do all my texture baking in Substance Painter. There are a few maps that you can't bake in Substance Painter, so I still use XNormal for that. The main texture that I remember you can't bake down would be vertex colors to texture, but you can do pretty much everything else in here. So in order to bake down your textures, you can go click on Bake Textures. And then here you have an option of what textures you want to bake down, right? So you have normal, world space normal, ID, ambient occlusion, curvature, position, and thickness. And then your output size. So I usually always bake at the highest resolution I'm going to use in game, so 4K, or for whatever project I'm going to use it for. And as I said, you can go up to 8K as well if you'd like. So I'm going to set this to 4K. And I'm going to select none. So you have the ability to select all or none up here, which will automatically check or uncheck all of these. I'm going to only do ambient occlusion. And then down here, you have the ability to, you have a few different options here. You have dilation width, which is basically how far to dilate the pixels outside of the UVs, just to make sure you don't get any bleeding or any seams. Down here, you have your high poly options, so you can go in and select which mesh you want to bake from down to your low poly. So usually you're always working in your game ready, which is your project ready, which is going to be your low poly mesh. And then if you have a high poly mesh, like for example, this was a photogrammetry capture that I retopologized. This is a low poly mesh. And then the original mesh was, I think it was a few million polygons. So if I wanted to bake down the normal detail from that to this, then I would select that mesh. And one thing to keep in mind, just with any kind of, same with any kind of bake down, is it uses cage matching. So the high poly mesh and the low poly mesh need to be aligned in the exact same place, same scale, and all that. So you're only getting the surface variation from the high poly to the low poly. That's how it's going to generate its the maps. It's based on the differences in the surface. So you can also check this box, which will use this mesh and bake it onto itself, which is good for getting like ambient occlusion, for example, in between these small little crevices, and just adds a little bit of detail to your surface if you don't have a high poly mesh, for example, or if you just want to get that information in between the surfaces. If you did want to select a high poly mesh, you can just click on this button here and then find your mesh. If you want to remove it, you just select it in this list and click this, this minus button. Whether or not to use the cage file, which you can use a separate cage file. Most instances you're not going to use that. Max frontal and rear distance, which you can modify. This is basically how far it looks for the bake data and the surface variation. Whether or not to be relative to the bounding box, average normals, ignore back facing. Match, you have always or by mesh name. Anti-aliasing, you can enable or disable that here, and you have different options. And then high poly mesh suffix and low poly mesh suffix. And then normal baker parameters, all of that. I don't have that enabled, so it's not giving me anything, so I don't really need it. If I go in and select this right here, which is going to allow me to use the low poly mesh as a high poly mesh, which means it's going to take this same mesh and bake it on itself and just get the information in between these areas here for my ambient occlusion, which is the only thing I'm baking right now. And then down here, it'll have two options if you have more than one texture set here. So if I had two texture sets here, it would allow me to bake just the textures for the texture set I have selected, or it's going to bake all, which means it's going to go through and do all of the material IDs here. So since I only have one, it gives me this one option, and I'm going to click that right now. For this mesh, it shouldn't take very long for it to bake down, especially since it's doing a low mesh as a high mesh. Okay, so as you can see, the baking has finished, and it has applied the ambient occlusion map that it baked automatically into my additional maps. So if I zoom in a little bit, you can already kind of see where the AO is showing up here. And if I disable the ambient occlusion for a second, so that's with it, that's without it. So as you can see, it was a bake down from a low mesh to a low mesh, but it adds a little bit of surface detail, especially when you start going in and using filters and generators and things like that. A lot of them require ambient occlusion or some kind of a mask, and AO is usually a really good one to use because you can get like edge scratches where these little surfaces connect and things like that. And you can go in and modify it with levels and all that to get some really cool surface information going on. All right, so we're going to get back to actually setting up materials and painting them on the surface and a few different techniques for that. But first, I'm going to go through the rest of the tool palettes here. So over on the left, you have your shelf. And once again, this is the default layout, so you can reorganize these however you like. I usually like to keep all my tool palettes on the right and my 3D view on the left. So over here, you have the shelf, which contains all the assets for your scene. So as you can see, you have a project. This is the additional map that I just rendered, so that's all that's being housed in here. These are the alphas, so you can use these as either stencils or alphas for your brushes. These are different kind of grunges. You can also use these for alphas. They're used by some of the generators and filters as well, I believe. You have procedurals, so these are used by the materials and smart materials, if I remember correctly. Textures, so these are all of the different normal maps, patterns, things like that. And most of the stuff you see in here is actually used by either the materials, generators, or effects that are already in here, unless you've imported them separately. Hard surfaces, so these are little, basically tools that you can use, kind of like Kit Bash, that you can go in and start creating different surface details with, and you can import your own as well, obviously. Filters, so these are all the filters that you can use on your masks and layers. These are different types of brush presets. These are different types of particles. So you can actually use basically a particle simulator inside of here to generate masks. So you can have like rain raining down on a surface to kind of get like water drops on your metal and things like that, which I'll go into as well. Tools, these are different types of tools that you can use. These are all the materials in your shelf. So as you can see, these are all default materials, and you can apply these by creating a fill layer and then just selecting it here and it'll apply it, and then you can go and modify the values, which I'm obviously going to touch on in a minute. Smart materials, so these are a little bit more advanced than regular materials, and these are actually full layer stacks. So if you bring one of these in, like say I bring in aluminum, for example, you just drag it in, it actually has a full layer stack to generate the type of aluminum that's here. This is a more simplistic one, but there are some that are more advanced. Let's see, like I believe this one here. So this one has a few more layers in it. So it really depends on what type of material you're using, and then when you bring it in, it's going to populate and go and modify all those layers individually. Smart masks. So these are masks that are used in combination with the generators to create like moss, concrete, edge rust, things like that. And you can just drag those in. So you'll see if I highlight this now after I drag that in, it's got a generator, it's got an MG mask editor, and then it's got all the parameters for that. And you can also apply these via generator, which I'm going to show you in a minute. And here you have your environments. So once again, these are all the smart image-based lighting textures that are applied to your dome. And then you have your different color profiles, which you can also apply to either your iRay render or down in the display settings that I was showing you before. All right, so going back into the layers palette, I'm actually going to go in and start creating the base for a material. So I'm going to hit delete. I almost always remove the default layer because it's not a fill layer, and I usually don't use standard layers at all for my material setups. So as I mentioned before, Substance Painter is basically Photoshop in 3D, and you're creating full materials with every brush stroke or filter rather than just a single texture. So the first thing I want to do is go in and create a material. So to do that, I am going to click on the fill layer icon up here, which is going to add a fill layer. And you can go in and rename it by just double clicking on it. So I'm going to call this one base. Now another thing to keep in mind with fill layers is that you can change all the values under here. As I said, this is contextual. So right now I have the fill layer selected and it doesn't have any real material applied to it. It's just a default base color setup. But over here you can modify the projection, so whether or not it's UV projection or triplanar. So triplanar will help remove, or actually it'll completely remove UV seams. For certain materials, it'll actually create warping in between the seams, so you want to kind of use it sparingly. Most of the time I use triplanar projection, but sometimes I have to go and do some manual cleanup to make sure there's no weird warping going on. What type of filtering is set up on that layer? So bilinear, high quality, sharp, or nearest. Tiling, whether or not to repeat or clamp. If you have it set to none, it's just going to show once. You have your scale, your offset, and your rotation. And then you also have the hardness down here, which you can go and change when you have a material applied to it. And then down here, as I said before, you have all your values for these material channels. So as I said, this has a default material applied to it, which is just a base color and some roughness and metallic values. So if I want to apply a material to it, I can just click on one over here in my materials palette with the fill layer selected. So as you can see, I just did that, and it applied this material to the surface. And you can see, since it's set to UV projection, there's a UV seam right here. And if I go into side-by-side view of UV and 3D, you can see that the material shows up in here. I can go in and change that material pretty easily by just clicking on another one. And as you can see, the 3D viewport is showing everything, the roughness, the metallic, the full PBR rendering there. So if I want to get rid of this UV seam, I can go over and change UV projection to triplanar. Now, as you can see, it does a really good job of eliminating the UV seams, but you will notice that where it blends in, you'll get some weird artifacting like this here or down here. So for most cases, it's fine, but you do want to keep an eye on that. And if you have to do any manual cleanup, like right here, it's not blending very well, then you want to go in and do that. All right, so I'm going to go back into just the 3D view. And let's say I want to only have this material applied to a certain object, right? So I'm going to go and select iron, actually. So let's call this one iron. Actually, no, I'm going to give an overall surface material first. So I'm going to search for paint. So this is your search box up here. You can change what you're searching for. I'm going to do peeled paint metal here. If you hover over any of these, it gives you a larger preview of what it looks like. And also, for the purposes of this demonstration, I'm going to change my working resolution to 1K. And once again, as I mentioned before, it's non-destructive, so I can go ahead and change that to anything else at any time. So this material looks a little bit more like something I would imagine a fire hydrant would have. And I can go ahead and change all the options in here, like color and all that, which I'm going to do real quick. So I'm going to change the paint color. I'm going to make it more of like a yellow-orange type of a color. Something a little bit more like that. I can go in and change the dirt color. I can go in and change all the settings. And all these settings are going to be based on the material that's that you have selected. So this one has quite a few options. Most of them are pretty straightforward. Dripping intensity, I can go in and modify all of these. As you can see, it all updates pretty much in real time. And those are all the settings for paint for the specific material, and these are all the settings for the metal itself, which I'm going to modify the roughness of. I'm going to make it a little bit more rough. So that's a pretty generic base for the fire hydrant. Now let's say I want to go in and make the bolts that are down here at the bottom kind of like a rusted metal. I can go in and do that. So there are a few ways I can go and do that. The first is I can go in and make a white mask for this and then unmask these, which means everything will show this material that I already have applied except for the bolts. Or I can just create another layer on top of that and have it override the material underneath. But a lot of times, unless you go in and change some other settings, those values for the normal and all that stuff, the normal map and all that stuff will show through the other material. So let's say I go in and add a white mask. So I can do that by right-clicking and add white mask. So as you can see, you have different values for mask here. You have white mask, black mask, bitmap mask, and add mask with color selection. So adding a white mask means that nothing is going to be masked out, and you can go and remove objects from the mask. Black mask means nothing will have the material applied to it, everything will be masked out, and then you can go in and add objects into that mask. And a bitmap mask is just that. You can bring in a black and white mask if you've already generated one like in Photoshop or created one in Substance Painter already, you can bring that in and apply that to it. So I'm going to add a white mask because I want to keep everything with the material applied to it. And then I'm going to go in and remove these nuts and bolts from that mask. So in order to do that, I'm going to select this tool here. I could go in and paint on it if I wanted to. So over here, since I have this brush selected and I have the mask selected, so these are two different objects in the layer, right? So I have the layer itself, which gives me all the material options, and the mask, which gives me just the options for that mask. So by default, the brush is set to black. If I click on this little icon here, it's going to swap between the right and the left selections. So if I set this to 2, it's going to go to the opposite of that 2, right? So if I have it at complete 0, it's going to go to 1 if I click this. I can also click on this and add, type in a value, so say like 0.5. Clicking on the little pencil icon allows me to do that. So I want to set this to black, and if I go in and paint this, as you can see, the material is disappearing as I paint it because I'm painting onto the mask. But rather than doing that, what I want to do is remove the bolt based on the UV. So I'm going to click on this icon here, which is the polygon fill. Now once I do that, you'll see it brings up this polygon fill palette over here, and it has a few different modes. So it has a triangle fill, polygon fill, mesh fill, or UV. So I'm going to click on UV, and I'm going to set this to black, which means it's going to, based on my selection, it's going to mask out the entire UV island for whatever I have selected. So if I drag that over this bolt, you'll see now the bolt is completely removed from the mask. So if I go back into the view here, and if I find that bolt, which it looks like it is right here, you can see it's completely masked out based on the UV island, right? So I can go and do that for all these bolts. Since they're all kind of lined up in a row, I can do that in the UV viewport as well. Now the reason it's usually better to do this is you get your edge will not have any color bleed because based on your texture resolution, it'll have color bleed if they're even if they're not close to each other. If you just go and paint it normally, if you're doing it like, say I wanted to get rid of just its edge here and I went and painted it, the fade between here would be based on the resolution of the texture. So if you want to get a really crisp edge, which I do for these, then you want to do it based on the UV itself. All right, so that's all of those bolts. I believe there are a few more in here, which I can just do in the viewport. And all these other selections act the same way. They're just based on what the surface is. So this one will literally just do one triangle at a time. And this one will do an entire poly at a time. This will do an entire mesh at a time. So you have multiple meshes in here. It'll do each of those individually. So one thing I forgot is that each of the top piece of these bolts are actually separate UV islands from the bolt themselves. So that's why none of these were selected. So I'm going to go back into the 3D viewport, just make sure everything is good. Okay, so go back here. You can see now all those bolts have been removed from this, this material layer, right? Right, so now let's say I want to go in and create a new material layer for just these bolts. So I'm going to create another fill layer above this. I'm going to call it bolts. I'm going to add a black mask to this because I don't want anything to have this material except for the bolts. I'm going to go manually add that in. So I'm going to go and grab another material. Let's say iron rusty. Sounds good. Actually, I need to have that layer selected first. So remember, when you create a mask, it's going to automatically highlight the mask, so you can't actually do anything to the layer until you select it. Okay, so now I can do one of two things. I can either go back in and select the mask and then have UV and set it to white and then go and select each bolt like this. Or since I've already unmasked these, I can take the mask that I've already created. I can right click on it. I can go to copy mask. I can right click here and I can actually paste into the mask. Now I don't want to do this on a black mask, right? So if I do that into a black mask, it's not going to do anything. So what I want to do is I actually want to remove that mask. I want to add a white mask to this as well, and then paste into that mask, right? So this is using the exact same mask as what I have below, but I want to invert that. So if I want to do that, I can click on, I can have the mask selected, and I can click on Add Effect, Add Levels, and then I can click on invert. So that's going to invert my mask that I've already created, which is a quick way to get what I already deselected back. So now you can see these bolts have a different material than the rest of the mesh because I went in and masked them separately. And then I can obviously go in and modify that material setup separately from everything else. So this one is using the iron rusty material over here. So I can go in and adjust things like height range, height level, all of that. But this one's not really giving me some of the parameters that I want, like roughness and all of that. So I'm going to change this material to something else. So let's try a different metal here. Let's see what rust fine looks like. All right. So since neither of these are giving me a roughness value, I can actually go in and fix that pretty easily. So I like the look of iron rusty more, but obviously it's not giving me a roughness value, which I do want to change, so I'll go in and set that up in a second. So now that I have that created, I can have this layer selected, and I can go in and uncheck rough, and then I can actually create another layer below that just for roughness. So I'm going to create another fill layer. I'm going to call this one bolts roughness. And I want to copy this mask. Or another way I could do this is actually just duplicate that layer, which might be a little easier. So I'm going to right-click on this and duplicate the layer. I could also just hit Control-D. So this one is bolts. The reason I did that is because I don't have to recreate this mask again, because you have to paste into the mask and then add levels and all that stuff again if you do it that way. So now what I want to do is unselect color, height, metallic, normal, and then select rough. And then I want to get rid of this material, right? So I'm just controlling roughness through here. And then I want to put this below this layer. And then I can go in and modify the roughness. Now I could have done that using a mask as well. So I can have a mask on top of a mask if I wanted to do that. Now in order to do that, I would actually create a folder. So I'm going to add these bolts into one folder. So I'm going to click on Add Folder here. I'm going to call it Bolts. I'm going to bring both of these layers into Bolts. Okay. And then if I want to, since this already has a mask, it's masking itself to this, I can go in and either create another folder with this with the mask on top of it, or I can take this mask, since it's being used by both of these layers, and copy it, and then just apply it to this folder. So that way everything underneath it has a mask, and then I can put masks on those layers separately from that. So I'm going to add a white mask. I'm going to paste into that mask, and it's already got the levels and everything applied to it. And now I can go and actually remove the masks from the individual layers underneath. Right? So everything is under this folder is being masked by this mask here. And then each of these layers can have a separate mask. So say for the roughness, for example, I want to add a bitmap mask to kind of break up the roughness a little bit. I can go in and do that. So I'm just going to find something that looks sort of like a roughness. I'm going to take this. So now my roughness mask has my roughness has a little bit of a mask to it. Go back in here. Roughness is disabled. And I can do the same thing for any of these material channels here, so metallic, all that good stuff. I can have individual layers for each one if I want to be able to have a little bit more control over them, or if the material doesn't give me the options that I want. And I can also go in and modify this mask once again by adding in a levels. And I can drag this around to kind of control how that mask affects the surface. And then in here, since I've already got that selected, I only want roughness available. And then I can go in and change that. All right, now let's say I want to bring in the albedo texture and the normal that I created from the photogrammetry solve of this. So I did create an albedo by projecting down the solve onto this low poly mesh, and then I created the normal by baking down the high over the low mesh. So what I want to do is get rid of all these layers that I've already created. I'm just going to select all of them, hit delete. And then from a window that I have off screen, I'm going to drag in the albedo and the normal. I'm going to drop them into my shelf over here. For both of these, I'm going to set them to texture. And I'm going to import them to my project. Now that those are imported, I can either add the normal map by doing it this way to my additional maps. As you can see, it now has normal information from that normal. That's without it, and that's with it. Or I can create a layer up here that has a normal map in it, only contributing to height, which I will get to in just a second. So what I want to do first, though, is add in this albedo. So I'm going to create a new fill layer. I'm going to set it to just be color. I'm going to click on the base color, and I'm going to look for my texture that I imported, so I know it's fire hydrant. So I just type that in, click on it. And now, as you can see, it has populated with the albedo that I already created. I'm going to call this albedo. Now let's say I want to have more control over my normal map, so rather than having it in the additional maps where I can't really do anything to it, I'm going to get rid of that there. I'm going to create a new fill layer. I'm going to call this one normal. And I'm going to leave everything unchecked except for normal and height. And actually, I'm not going to check height either. I'm just going to leave normal checked. And in the normal, I'm going to look for hydrant, which is this. Now, as you can see, I have that layer available to modify that's just giving me normal information rather than having it down here where I can't really control it. So I could go in and mask that. Let's say I don't want the normal map to show up here or on these little metallic areas. I can go in and manually paint that if I like. Okay. And now let's say I want to sharpen this albedo texture slightly. It's obviously set to 1K. When I bump it up to 4K, it's going to look much better. But let's say I just want to give it a little bit of a sharpening just to improve the quality a little bit. I can click on the layer itself. I can go into my Add Filter Generator button, and then I can click on Add Filter. With the filter selected, I can click on Filter over here and look for Sharpen, which is right here. Now, as you can see, the default value is very intense, but let's say I just want it to be very subtle. I can drop it down to like 0.25. That's without it. That's with it on. As you can see, it cleans up the texture quite a bit. It's not too sharp, but it does improve the quality a bit. All right, so now that that's set up, let's say I want to go in and I want to start cleaning up some areas of this. Let's say I want to get rid of some rust that's on here, if I have some weird projection errors on the mesh itself from a photogrammetry solve, or whatever the case might be. I want to basically go in and start cleaning that up. I will show you how to go about doing that. So the first thing you want to do is create a new layer, and you don't want this to be a fill layer. It has to be a regular layer for this to work. So you go up here and create a new layer. Then for the base color, you want to select the same albedo texture that you have for the other layer, the one that you're going to be using to use the clone stamp tool with. And then you want to set its blend mode to pass through. So I'm just going to call this layer albedo patch. Now with the albedo patch layer selected, you can go up to your clone stamp tool here. This little icon to the right of it tells you whether or not, or tells Substance Painter whether or not you want to keep the source relative to the brush, which means if you sample and you go and brush, it's always going to stay in the same spot. So by default, it's on, and it's usually what you're going to use most of the time. So let's say I want to sample this area and start getting rid of this lettering down here. I hold V and click where I want to sample from, and that little square will show up. And then if I let go of V and start painting, you'll see that the square moves with the brush, and it's actually clone stamping over the surface. Now the reason you still see detailed letters here as I paint is because normal is enabled. The normal map is actually injecting into it. So I can go ahead and start cleaning this up a little bit more. Now obviously this is a really rough demonstration of how this works, but you can go in and make it a lot more accurate and clean up much better depending on what you're actually doing with it. So I can also go up here, and it works, in triplanar, so you can go in and kind of like brush this out along the edge, and it does a pretty good job. All right, so that's how you use the clone stamp tool. I'm gonna go back over to my regular paint tool. So now I want to go in and start painting these areas that are metallic to actually make them look like metal and all that, which I don't get with the albedo. It's just going to use an overall roughness value. So there are a couple ways I can go about doing that. I can actually manually go in and start painting by creating a new layer. I can call this one roughness metal, and I can give it just a black mask. And once again, I give it a color of red just for visualization purposes as I'm going in and painting it in. And then if I go in here and just start painting white values into the mask, I can actually go in and just start painting wherever I want my metallic values to be, right? So let's say I want to paint in this whole top piece. I can just do that real quickly. You don't have to be completely accurate if you don't want to. In most use cases, you're not going to notice, a few pixel differences as it gets closer to the edge. All right, so now that's done, I can go back in here and I can disable color, everything except for roughness and metallic, right? And then I can bump the metallic value all the way up. And I can go in and modify my roughness a little bit. So now that surface is a little shinier, and it's got a little more shiny than the rest of the surface, and it's got a metallic value applied to it. Now let's say I didn't want to have to go manually paint in all of these values for all of the metallic in here. Another thing I can do is I can take my albedo into Photoshop. I'm just going to bring that into here. I'm going to create a black background since this already has an alpha. Now I can either go in and desaturate this or use black and white to desaturate and then kind of select the areas where the rust is, since there's a high contrast between the colors of the rust and the yellow. Or I can go in and do a selective color and then desaturate that. And that's the technique I'm going to use for this. So I'm going to go in and do image adjustment and levels, just kind of bring out those colors a little bit more. Bump up the contrast a little bit. And I can also go in and modify hue and all that to kind of get better isolation on those colors. But for now, I'm just going to use this as reference. So I'm going to go into Select, Color Range with that layer selected, the albedo layer. And I'm going to go ahead and select like a mid-range where I think that color is, which is probably somewhere around here. And then I can go in and modify my fuzziness, and it'll show me a preview here of what it's selecting. So basically what this is going to do is only select colors in that range I just selected. So as you can see, it's getting mostly just the rust values, which is what I want. So now that I have that, I can go in and create a new layer, hit D and then X to set the default colors, and then swap the background to the front, which will be white. Shift F5, which will fill with that color if it's set to foreground. Control D to dehighlight, to deselect, and then I get rid of my albedo layer. So now you can see I have basically a mask of all of my rust areas for the most part. This is pretty rough, but it'll do the job for what I want to do rather than having to go in and do all that manual work. Then I can just layer flatten. Then I'm going to save this as a metal mask. Go ahead and close Photoshop. Then I can bring that mask into Substance Painter. Now, on a side note, this is something to keep in mind. If you ever import assets and then you're not using them and they're kind of like cluttering up your shelves here, if they're not being used in any layers or anything like that, you can go to File and then Clean, and then it'll remove any of those assets that you're not using that you imported that aren't default assets. I'm going to enable a normal map again just to bring it back in. So I'm going to drag in that mask that I just created from the albedo in Photoshop. I'm going to set this as a alpha. Bring it into my project, hit import. Now that that's done, I can go into this roughness metal, and then I can actually get rid of this black mask that I created. So I'm going to remove mask. Then I can add in a bitmap mask, and then select the one that I just brought in, which is alpha. The reason I wasn't showing before is because I had a filter of only textures, and I brought this in as an alpha, so I had to get rid of that. So now that I have that mask, now you can see that the mask is actually controlling where the metallic values show up on the surface, and it's a lot more realistic looking. And I didn't have to go in and do any manual work, really. So if I go back in here and I enable color, you can see exactly where it's coming from. You can see it did a pretty good job of isolating all of that where the rust was. So that gives you a pretty basic setup for PBR workflow, especially if you're using a photogrammetry asset and you already have the albedo texture. So now that all that's set up, let's say I want to go in and add a little bit of grunge in between all these little areas, basically where the ambient occlusion is. I can go and do that by using the AO as a mask for that grunge. So I'm going to create another layer at the top here, another fill layer. I'm going to call this one, I'm just going to call it dirt. Once again, I'm going to set this to red just for visualization purposes. And I'm going to uncheck everything for it except for roughness and color. So what I want to do here is I want to add in a bitmap mask, and I'm going to use the ambient occlusion that I already created. this here. Now, as you can see, it is using the ambient occlusion as a mask, but I want to invert it because I want this to show up in the little areas where the AO is rather than the opposite. So I'm going to go up here and add a levels, and I'm going to click invert. So now that I've done that, you can see that the red is showing up only where the AO is. And then I can go in and slide this around to kind of control how far it spreads. So now what I want to do is go in and change this material that I've applied to it. And let's say I want it to be a... Let's use this iron rusty over here. So now you can see what that looks like without it, and then with it enabled. And I can always go back into my levels and adjust like how far it spreads, etc. Just kind of give it cooler surface information. So now let's say I want to do that, but then I also want to kind of break this surface up a little bit. I can go in and create a folder up here. I'm going to call this dirt as well. I'm going to drag dirt inside of that. And I'm going to create a black mask on top of that. Now on top of this black mask, I want to apply a generator. I'm going to apply a dirt generator. So I'm going to click on this one more time. I'm going to click on add generator. I'm going to click on the generator button over here, and I'm going to click MG dirt. So what this has done is now I have a mask on top of a mask. So this mask here is controlling, it's basically controlling where the rust shows up based on the AO that I gave it, and then with the levels that I applied to it. And then this one is actually breaking up that surface using a dirt generator. So if I select this MG dirt, I can go in and modify the settings for that. And that allows me to really fine-tune how that dirt shows up on the surface. So if I hide that layer stack and then show it, we can see the difference. All right, and now that all that's set up, I have a pretty decent looking asset so far. Now say I want to go in and add a distressing to the top that looks like maybe rain poured down on it or something like that. I can go in and do that as well. So I'm going to create another fill layer. I'm just going to call this one rain damage. I'm going to add a black mask to it. I'm going to go over to my particles in the palette in my shelf over here. And then up at the top, I'm going to change my brush to physical paint. As you can see, it's going to show a preview of what I already have selected. So I want to go over to, let's try rain. And then I already have my brush set to white, so it's going to add white into the mask. So I'm going to change this color to red just so it's a little bit more apparent. Select my mask again. And then I'm going to click and drag. The longer I hold click down, the longer it's going to simulate the particles. And as you can see, it says animation time over here. So what it's doing is actually dropping particles into the scene and adding into the mask based on where those particles hit and how they interact with the surface. So this gives you a lot of control over like weathering and things like that on your asset. Now let's say I go in and bump the brush scale up a little bit. Bumping the brush scale up actually controls how big each particle is, right? And if I do it as the particles are dropping, you'll see that the particles change size as they're simulating. And if I go into one of the others, let's say Sandstorm, for example, if I just click on it, it'll change it. Or I can go into Burn over here and use that one. Electric Circuit, go ahead and use that one. So as you can see, each of these has a very different effect, and you can kind of utilize it as you like for your mesh. And then you can also go in and obviously add this masked layer into a folder with a different mask. So say you only want it to affect this area, you can do that. And then if I go in and let's say I put it back to rain, and then I bump up the scale again, and then have it rain a little bit. Let's drop it down a little more, something like that. And then if I go in and change this to any material, like let's say aluminum or this gold aluminum color. As you can see, that's the material is going to show through the mask. Because all you're doing is using those particle systems to generate the mask. All right, so let's go over one last thing before I show you how to do a texture export and setup. So I touched on a stencil earlier, and I'm going to show you how to use that real quick. So basically a stencil acts as an alpha that is based on, it just overlays over your screen. You can paint on it just like a stencil in the real world, right? You just hold the stencil up to the wall, and then you apply the spray paint over it, and the shape comes through based on the stencil. So it's the same idea here. So in order to use a stencil, I'm just going to go in and create a new layer. Let's call this one paint. I'm going to set the color red once again just for reference so I can see where I'm painting. I'm going to right click, add a black mask. And then I'm going to bring in a alpha that I've already created, so I'm just going to drag this in into my palette. I'm going to tell it that it's an alpha. I'm going to select project is what I want it to import as, and I'm going to hit import. Now the alpha I just brought in is just my CMYGA logo, but this can be any black and white texture. And then if I go over to a stencil, I can select the alpha that I just brought in, which is this one. And now you can see that the screen is overlaid with the stencil. Now, once again, I can go in and modify the stencil scale by holding S and right-click dragging. I can pan it, and I can with the middle mouse and S, and then I can rotate with middle mouse and, S and the left mouse. And if I hold Shift, it's going to snap the rotation every 90 degrees. Once again, if you hold S or any modifier, it'll show you what you can modify here. So now if I go in and start painting on top of this, because my brush is set to white and I have the stencil active, you'll see the stencil disappears and it starts showing what I'm painting. If I get rid of the stencil for a second, you can see that it painted on the surface based on the stencil, based on my camera angle, right? So if I do it this way, right? Let's say I enable the stencil again. Let's say I go here, it's going to be a little more stretched out, and I go in and paint. You can see it's based on the camera angle from where the stencil was that time. So that's a little bit more distorted on this. I can also go and do that in the UV viewport, same exact way. And the stencil modifier, so the scale, rotation, and panning, all stuff is separate between your UV view and your 3D view, which gives you more control. So now I can go in here and paint the stencil on here in the 3D view, in the UV viewport. Hide the stencil one more time, and you can see it painted on here. Now, as you can see, it's a little more distorted because of the UV map, but based on your UV map, you can get different results depending on how you go and use the stencil. Now, one more thing that you can do to control the stencil, I'm going to bring it back in again, is under your viewer settings, you can go in and modify the stencil opacity. And you can enable or disable hiding the stencil when you paint. So by default, it's enabled. So if I go in and paint, it disappears as soon as I start painting and reappears when I let go. And if I uncheck that, it'll just stay there as I'm painting. All right, so now that that's out of the way, I think I've kind of given you a good rundown of just about everything in Substance Painter that you're going to use in most production workflows. I'm going to show you how to go about setting up a texture export and exporting your texture sets to be used in whatever application you're going to be importing them into. So the first thing you want to do is set your document size to the resolution you're going to export to. If you have it set to a lower resolution in your document size and you go to export a higher resolution, it's actually going to upscale. It won't actually be restructuring everything at that resolution. So I'm going to set it to 4K because that's usually the resolution I like to use. I like to use the highest resolution I might use in whatever software I'm going to be importing into, and then modify it in that software to kind of get the compression settings that I might be using in Engine that way, or in the software that way. So let's do one more check on everything. Everything looks good. Let's say this is a finalized asset and I'm happy with it and I want to export it. So I can go over to File, Export Textures. And then you'll be greeted with this dialog here. So you have an export tab and a configuration tab. So I already have my export path selected. In order to change that, you just click on it and select the folder you want to export to. This little curly arrow will revert to the default export path, which is in one of the root folders for Substance Painter. And then this is the image format you can use, or you want to export to. So it has BMP, JPEG, PNG, all of the pretty much any file format you want to export your textures to. You have your bit depth, 8 or 16. You have your configuration, which I'm going to go over in a second. You have your dilation, which will allow you to modify how the pixels are dilated outside of the UV islands. And if you set it to a custom value, you can modify the pixels here. And you can also go in and change the dilation value under each material ID. So this is your material ID, and this checkbox tells you whether or not, or tells Substance Painter whether or not to export that material ID. So if you have a bunch of them and you only want to export one, you can just check that one. And you also have a select all or select none for that. If you want to override padding per material ID, you can do that here by checking this box and then changing the value here rather than using the common value. And then this checkbox down here will allow you to export the shader parameters. All right, so now I'm going to go over setting up a configuration. So by default, Substance Painter has a bunch of default configurations for Arnold, for Unity, for CryEngine, Unreal Engine, all that good stuff. So we're going to create our own just to make sure we get the most optimized export for what we want. So I'm going to click on the configuration tab. I'm going to click the plus to add a new preset. I'm going to right click and call this whatever I want to. For the purposes of this demonstration, I'm just going to call it test config. And then over here, you'll see that you have a list of output maps that you can select the channel setup for. And then over here, you have the list of maps you can put into those channels, right? So you have input maps, mesh maps, and converted maps. So over here, next to create, you have gray, which is going to be a grayscale. You have RGB, which is going to be RGB combined. And you have RGB separated, so you can put a map into each of those channels. You have RGB combined with A separated, and then you have RGBA each separated. So the first one I'm going to create is going to be an RGB with an A separated. Then I'm going to create an RGB combined. Then I'm going to create an RGBA separated. So this first one is going to be my albedo trans, my translucency. So I'm going to click on this $, which will allow me to select a autofill, either using the project name, mesh name, or texture set. So I'm going to call it, I'm going to do the mesh, do underscore albedo trans for albedo translucency. I'm going to do the same thing here, mesh, this is going to be my normal. And then this last one is going to channel pack my roughness, metallic, ambient occlusion, and emissive. So I'm going to do mesh, ARM-AE, right? Roughness, metallic, ambient occlusion, and emissive. So now I want to populate these. These aren't actually populated. This doesn't know to bring in my albedo. This doesn't know to bring in my translucency, etc. So base color is going to be my albedo. I'm going to drag that over and select RGB channels. My translucency will be my opacity. I'm going to drag this into the alpha and set it to the gray channel since it's just a black and white value. My RGB for normal will be just that. Now I don't want to use the normal from the input maps. I actually want to use the normal DirectX. The reason I want to do that is because most of the normal information that you see in the Substance Painter is actually height information. If you don't use that normal DirectX, it actually won't convert that height information to your normal, and you won't get that information in your texture set. All right, so then I want to do my roughness. It's going to go into the red channel over here. Once again, it's going to be gray because it's just black and white. My metallic value is going to go into the green. My ambient occlusion will go into the blue channel. And then my emissive is going to go into the alpha. All right, now that all of that is set up, you can see that everything is color-coded. So my base color is this red, and it's got the little swatch here. My emissive is green, and it's got the little swatch here. So it's easy to kind of correlate what is inputted where. So I'm going to go back to my export dialog, and I'm going to select the config that I just created here from the dropdown. And as you can see, it's going to update based on whatever I have selected. So if I go in and change this to Unity 5 packed or any of these in here, you can see that it changes based on what I have selected. So I'm going to go back down to the test config that I just created, so you'll see what it's going to export and how it's going to be named. So that $mesh, as you can see, created fire hydrant 001 underscore albedo trans because the mesh is named fire hydrant 001. And it did underscore normal, underscore RMAE, etc. So now that it's set up, I can just click on export, and it will export those textures for me. So obviously, depending on how many layers you have, how intense your material setup is, what resolution you're using, how many texture sets, all of that is going to change what the export time is, but it's usually pretty quick, especially for something like this. So as you can see, it's now done, and it just did that in real time as I was talking. Now that those are exported, you can see that it created the 3 textures for me. So I have my fire hydrant 001 albedo trans, my underscore normal, and my underscore RMAE. And these are all PNG files, and they're all channel packed. So this one has my roughness, metallic, ambient occlusion, and emissive. This is my normal. This has my albedo with the translucency packed into the alpha. So this is extremely efficient for anything that you're going to be, any workflows that you have, because you're consolidating basically 7 different textures into 3 texture files. So your file size is smaller, the amount of assets that you have to keep track of is less, and your performance overhead is going to be better because of the way it interprets the data, and overall it's just much better for workflow. All right. So that pretty much concludes the overview for Substance Painter. If you do have any questions, please just leave them in the comments, and I will reply to them as quickly as I can if I'm able to. And hope you enjoyed this overview.